This Watershed Wednesday Webinar Series. This evening's session, Unraveling the Gordian Knotweed, Management of Japanese Knotweed in the Catskills, will be presented by Dan Snider-Nerp of the Catskill Regional Invasive Species Partnership. This presentation will last approximately 50 minutes, and there will be time for questions at the end. Please use the Q&A box to submit those questions to us. You can also submit them through the chat if you would like, but again, just make sure that that is set to go to everyone. My name is Amanda Cabanillas. I'm the Education and Outreach Coordinator at Greene County Soil and Water Conservation District. This webinar series is being offered as part of 2024's Schoharie Watershed Month. Schoharie Watershed Month is a month-long series of free community events that celebrate and raise awareness of the waterways that flow across the Schoharie Reservoir watershed, as well as the 315 square miles of land that feed them. After this evening's webinar, we have two more opportunities to celebrate Schoharie Watershed Month. And those are the last webinar session on Catskill wetlands next Wednesday, and the BioBlitz celebration this coming Saturday at the Mountaintop Arboretum. The BioBlitz celebration includes bird, insect, wetlands, and plant walks, as well as a watershed craft station and a performance by Arm of the Sea Theater. Information about those events can be found on the homepage of our website, gcswcd.com. These programs are offered for free to the watershed community and have been made possible by the Schoharie Watershed Stream Management Program, which is a partnership between Greene County Soil and Water Conservation District and the New York City Department of Environmental Protection. Again, this evening's session, Unraveling the Gordian Knotweed, Management of Japanese Knotweed in the Catskills, will be presented by Dan Snider-Nerp. Dan Snider-Nerp is the Terrestrial Invasive Species Manager at CRISP. He has worked at CRISP managing priority invasive species for 9 years and is a licensed pesticide applicator. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to you, Dan. Thank you for being here and welcome.
Hi, everyone. I'm Dan Snider-Nerp. Was just mentioned, I am the Terrestrial Invasive Species Manager for the Catskills Regional Invasive Species Partnership, which is a program of the Catskill Center located in Arkville, New York. Today, we're going to be getting in depth with Japanese knotweed. There we go. Okay, so the Gordian knotweed. I thought this was a good way to sort of relate to the expectations around knotweed, in addition to having a fun, punny name. So the legend of the Gordian knot is that there was a country who had been missing a rightful king for quite a while, and it got so desperate that an oracle decreed or suggested that the next king should be whoever rides into the capital's gates driving an ox cart. And that happened to be Gordius, who was declared king. Gordius was a peasant at the time, and he took the post and he tied his ox cart very, very carefully to a post. And Gordius ruled for a while, and his intricate, fastidious, fiendishly difficult knot was dubbed impossible to see how they were fastened, they being the various knots that went into this massive knot tying the ox cart to the post. Years later, another oracle declared that whoever could unravel this knot was destined to become the ruler of Asia. And as the legend goes, Alexander the Great came upon the knot and cut it with a sword. So I think similarly, whoever can come up with a fast and easy way to deal with the horrific mess that often is a Japanese knotweed infestation is destined for some pretty great things. Unfortunately, I do not have a silver bullet, a single sword swing solution for you guys tonight, but I have a lot of potential management methods that can be applied and do show promise in a lot of situations in terms of controlling Japanese knotweed. So first, I'm going to go through a couple of like broad definitions to make sure we're all working from the same base here. And the first step is, of course, what's an invasive species? Japanese knotweed is an invasive species, but invasive species, pest species, non-native species all kind of get thrown around a lot. And they can get kind of muddled or confused. So for New York, for CRISP, and for the purposes of this talk, when I say an invasive species, I mean something that specifically is not native to the ecosystem of New York in this case, but the actual definition in environmental conservation law is not native to whatever ecosystem is being considered. So you could have something that's like not native to a specific county. And the species also has to cause harm to the economy, to human health, or to the environment, or has to be likely to cause those kinds of harms. Any one of the three, not all three at once. And good examples of this are Asian longhorn beetle that threatens both New York's economy, being a huge, broad generalist species that feeds on an immense amount of hardwood tree species, and also threatens the environment in the same way, of course. And then there's giant hogweed, which is a threat to human health through its sap that can eventually lead to really awful skin burns if you get the sap on you. Okay, so invasive species are considered a threat to New York's biodiversity. They threaten many aspects of human well-being. And I mentioned this too because I think we're all here because we know Japanese knotweed is a bad plant and we want to deal with it. But it's important to specify this kind of thing too, because there can be pushback against invasive species and management of invasive species specifically. Actually, just earlier today, I found a blog espousing the benefits of Japanese knotweed infestations. So invasive species in general are a threat to New York's biodiversity, to water quality, like in New York specifically, where I guess I should say in regards to knotweed specifically, not all invasive species are a threat to water quality. But they can contribute to habitat degradation in the habitats they occur, habitat loss for native species, decreased water quality, loss of native fish, wildlife, and plants. So that's that loss of biodiversity. The loss of recreational opportunities, tourism income, crop and forest damage. There's a whole host of things that invasive species can harm and degrade, which is why it's important to manage them, and it's important to manage them early. And in terms of managing invasive species and managing invasive species infestations early before they can grow and spread too much, the Catskill Regional Invasive Species Partnership, or CRISP, right here on the map. That's us. That's my region of New York here. CRISP's mission is to promote the education, prevention, early detection, and control about and of invasive species to limit their impact on the ecosystems and economies of the Catskills. CRISP is hosted by a nonprofit, the Catskill Center for Conservation and Development, which I mentioned before. And our region stretches about 3.3 million acres from Port Jervis down here, way past Cooperstown. It's a pretty big region. But I just want to point out there are similar partnership organizations throughout all of New York. So no matter where you are in New York, you have an organization. You have several actually between the Cornell Cooperative Extensions, the Soil and Water conservation districts, and the PRISMs, Partnerships for Regional and Invasive Species Management, you have several resources to draw on for knowledge and advice and maybe help dealing with invasive species. So I mentioned the CRISP region. We're pretty large, and specifically we cover all of Otsego, Schoharie, and Delaware counties, and we cover most of Greene, Ulster, and Sullivan, and a little tiny tip of Orange County way down here. We only have that little piece of orange because this border is Route 209, which splits between CRISP and Lower Hudson Prism. Okay, so all of the PRISMs, the partnership organizations, organize and prioritize our invasive species management efforts by this invasion curve, where we categorize species by Tier 1, Tier 2, Tier 3, and Tier 4. And that tier system loosely refers to the number and size of populations of an invasive species throughout a given region. At the PRISM level, we prioritize species into these tiers at the regional level, but I want to specify that this curve is really, really useful to sort of think about the invasive species that are happening on any scale of property. Private homeowners can use this scale of prioritizing invasive species management to think about how many resources, how much money, how much time and labor they'll need to put into dealing with an invasive species that's on their property or approaching their property. Maybe your neighbor has planted or is ignoring an infestation on their property, and you don't want that plant on your property. You could go talk to them. It's free, it takes a little bit of time, but it is prevention is always the easiest way to deal with an invasive species. As it spreads onto your property, you have a minimal amount of labor and time investment to eradicate that species. As the population goes unmanaged or maybe is not managed correctly, the population can grow, and you get into Tier 3 and Tier 4 species. Japanese knotweed, unsurprisingly, is a Tier 4 species in the CRISP region. It's incredibly widespread. It's at the region-wide scale a very, very difficult problem to tackle in terms of eradication. That doesn't mean it's always going to be an untackleable, unscalable problem on the property level, the individual property level. So I encourage you to assess your own Japanese knotweed infestations on this scale, Tier 1 being species absent, Tier 2 being a new, like a year or two of Japanese knotweed establishment, Tier 3 being a little bit more widespread, a little bit more well-established, and Tier 4 being maybe you just learned about Japanese knotweed and it has been growing unchecked on your property for years. It's a really good way to frame a management project. Okay, so we're getting into Japanese knotweed identification. Again, I think it's likely that a lot of us are intimately familiar with Japanese knotweed. But just to make sure we're all on the same level here. So even the young stalks of Japanese knotweed have these very noticeable swollen nodes, which are the knots of knotweed. They're pretty light green stalks. They can be even paler than in this picture, and they have pretty prominent purple splotching. Eventually, the stalks can grow to 8 to 12 feet tall and can grow in incredibly dense stands, completely crowding out any understory species at all, and making it basically, I have been to creeks in the Catskills where it's impossible to access a fishing spot without a machete. Let's see. So more on the mature stalks here. You can see that pale green color with the purple splotching all throughout it. The hollow stems that are part of Japanese knotweed. And I'm just comparing it to bamboo here because oftentimes Japanese knotweed is mistakenly referred to as bamboo. It's not bamboo. There are different species. Japanese knotweed doesn't get as hard and woody and fibrous, although it is a pretty fibrous plant. As for the leaves, they can be anywhere from like 2 to 6 inches long. They're spade-shaped is always how I've referred to them. I've heard some people call them like cordate, just like heart-shaped. I think they look a little more like a hand trowel or a spade. And for Japanese knotweed, the undersides of the leaves are hairless. And they grow in this like knotted zigzag pattern that we see in the bottom right very prominently. The flowers of Japanese knotweed are really, really prolific and abundant. There are these tiny, creamy white flowers that happen in these small clusters overtopping the stalks. This is a reason why bees love them, because the flowers are so abundant, and also in many places Japanese knotweed has just crowded out anything else that may flower. But we're going to talk about bees and how they love knotweed a little later in the presentation. And the rhizomes of Japanese knotweed, big part of why this plant is so awful to deal with. These rhizomes are really, really robust. They can get very thick and very, very prodigious. They can grow 8 to 10 feet deep, and they can extend out from the above ground biomass 10 to 20 feet horizontally. So even if you think you found the edge of a Japanese knotweed infestation, the rhizomes can actually extend 20 feet past that underneath the soil. Okay, so as with all invasive species, I would categorize early management as critical, but for Japanese knotweed, it really, really is. Japanese knotweed spreads very quickly. It's a really robust and vigorous plant. Even with herbicide applications, you're probably looking at a couple of years of management. And the costs of a Japanese knotweed infestation, not just ecologically, but economically to homeowners, it can be pretty high. So if we think back to that invasion curve, any unmanaged invasive species project is going to be more expensive the longer you wait to start it. But with Japanese knotweed and how it spreads primarily through vegetative reproduction in New York, which means that this plant can sprout from almost any clipping of the stalk or rhizomes. Anything that's like 1 inch to 2 inches long in terms of the stalk can, if it lands downstream during a flood event or something like that, or a tire crunches over Japanese knotweed and picks up a small piece of the stalk caked in mud, and then it falls off somewhere else, that piece can sprout into a new plant. It's part of why it spreads so rapidly. So I'd really, really stress early management of Japanese knotweed is very, very critical. So examples of why that's particularly relevant to private landowners. It can overgrow small walls, it can push down and uproot fences, it can crack through brickwork. The rhizomes can pretty easily block drains and pipes. It can grow through and crack concrete and tarmac. The most famous case of this happening actually comes from the UK, where Japanese knotweed was growing in someone's back garden and eventually grew underneath the soil of the house and penetrated through the foundation and grew into their living room through their floorboards. This is a live Japanese knotweed plant growing in someone's house. The end result of that is that their house value the value of their house and their land basically shot down from like $400,000 to like $60,000. I did some rough conversions to dollars, just so we could really like get a grasp on the scope of it. That's a huge fall. There's also some cases, well, in New York, spreading this plant is illegal. There's a prohibited and regulated species list where establishing and spreading and just transporting certain plants is illegal and can be fined. And in the US, most of the cases of like legal implications in regards to knotweed are in terms of like moving contaminated soil or moving contaminated gravel, that kind of thing. I don't think there's been a similar case to this in the US yet. But now in the UK, it's actually legally required that someone discloses that they have a Japanese knotweed infestation on their property before they sell. You really don't want to let it get to this, get this bad. This is really more of a like mid to late infestation case. You can tell this bottom picture here is not an early management situation for Japanese knotweed. That knotweed has been growing for years and years and years. But streamside monocultures of Japanese knotweed is what you get when you ignore a Japanese knotweed infestation along a streamside, or it just goes unmanaged, maybe because it's not known about, or no one knows who's supposed to manage it, or there just aren't funds for it. And those streamside monocultures can lead to increased erosion. That erosion can lead to sedimentation in the water, which can decrease water quality. It can crowd out recreation access. You can pretty easily, I think, imagine how difficult it would be trying to push through this thick of a knotweed patch here to get to the creek. It also decreases species diversity across taxa, not just the plants that are growing along there, but it can also decrease the number of invertebrates that can make use of the stream and the soil. And so we come to management. So before we get into management in detail, I want to talk about the cycle of management to sort of go back to that idea of there being no real like single sword cut to dealing with the problem of Japanese knotweed. Management of invasive species is a process. It's a cycle where at the end you assess what you've done, and you may need to modify the procedure, whatever you ended up going with, but you'll almost certainly have to come back to either monitor the site or remanage whatever's coming back. I really encourage people, if they want to go in depth on this cycle and think about like what questions and assessments go into it, to check out this packet, Managing Invasive Plants in Riparian Areas by the DEC. The link is right here. But basically, the booklet takes you really in depth through how you approach making an invasive species management plan. And the first is to establish goals. So think about the size of the infestation, think about the funds you have, think about your timeline. You prioritize your infestations. Are you going to try to tackle everything at once? Are some infestations more important to you to deal with? You look at your site, you develop a site plan, you implement the management, you monitor it, and then you assess the success and modify and revisit that cycle from the start. Now we're getting into these specific management options. Okay, so tarping and wire mesh are, I'm going to first go through like mechanical methods, then I'm going to get into herbicide methods and talk a little bit about the biocontrol for Japanese knotweed. So first we'll start with tarping and wire mesh, which are relatively low low labor options for managing Japanese knotweed. Essentially for tarp, you lay down hardware cloth or heavy tarps over the Japanese knotweed infestation after you cut the stems or fold them over, or you can lay it out early in the spring before the stalks come up. And this is actually a pretty key detail for both tarp and wire mesh. You want to make sure your tarp or wire mesh extends past the above ground stalks of Japanese knotweed, at least 10 to 15 feet. 15 is probably the sweet spot. So wherever you like stop seeing Japanese knotweed, you really want to make sure the tarp extends out another 10 to 15 feet past that. And that's to prevent rhizome sprouts and runners. The stalks will actually happily just grow horizontally along the ground, seeking sunlight, and that extra distance stops them from finding it. Then you would secure the tarp and wire mesh to the ground with lawn staples. They've used wooden stakes in this picture. That can work as well. I called this low labor because you're only like cutting down the stalks once, and then you put the tarp out. But it does require some upkeep. We talked earlier about how Japanese knotweed will like crack bricks and concrete, and it'll spear right through your tarp. So you'll need to revisit it occasionally, cut down stalks that grow through the tarp, patch the tarp. But compared to other mechanical methods, it's pretty light labor. Something to keep in mind, especially with Japanese knotweed, this method isn't really suitable for places that see heavy flood events or regular flood events. It's pretty easy for the floodwaters to get under the tarp and lift the whole tarp off. And part of this method really requires the tarp and the wire mesh to be in place for multiple growing seasons. You might, if all you're doing is tarping a Japanese knotweed infestation, depending on how long the knotweed has been there, you could be looking at like 5 to 10 years of tarp coverage before you really see effective management, although 10 years is a pretty extreme length of time. As far as the wire mesh, it's an alternative to tarping. The idea is that the young stalks are thin enough that they can grow through the mesh, and as the stalks mature, they expand and they get girdled on the wire mesh metal. The idea is that that will exhaust the nutrient stores and resources of the Japanese knotweed's rhizomes, and eventually cause it to die off. I will say, in terms of wire mesh, efficacy of this method hasn't really been rigorously demonstrated yet. It seems promising, but I haven't been able to find any cases of it being like a really strong contender. But I do think it's promising, and I think it would be a good stepping stone or part of a management plan. Okay. Oh, and I want to say, similar to the tarp, the wire mesh should be placed out past the visible extent of the Japanese knotweed. Okay. More mechanical management options. And by mechanical, I basically mean just non-herbicide options. So first we'll start with repeated cutting. I would not generally recommend this method to most people. Repeated cutting is just, it comes with a whole bunch of problems, and it's just not really effective for the amount of labor that you have to put into it. Most studies I've seen suggest that you need at least 3, but probably more repeated cuttings per year for a Japanese knotweed infestation to start seeing reduction of population size. And you're going to have to reproduce that effort every year. So 3, 4, or 5 cuttings every year. It's a big undertaking, and it can be pretty dangerous because the cuttings of the plant, any stalks that break off, can grow into new plants. So it makes it really, really easy to spread it. When you're doing cuttings, you have to consider how you're going to dispose of these cut stalks so that you don't accidentally spread it around, especially in New York, where introduction and transport of live plant material is against the law. Along the same lines to cutting, I've heard people ask about mowing. Never mow Japanese knotweed. It's a really, really great way to spread Japanese knotweed. The little stock fragments get caught in the equipment, that get moved around. Depending on the mower, the stock fragments might just get flung out away from the mower and establish elsewhere. I would really never recommend mowing at all. Repeated cutting can be part of a larger management plan. It can be effective for small patches. But I would encourage people to think about other mechanical options before they considered cutting if they're dealing with anything other than a very, very small infestation and a very new infestation of Japanese knotweed. Hand digging, another mechanical option that's really only appropriate for very, very small, very new infestations of Japanese knotweed, for similar reasons to cutting. You don't have to repeatedly dig up at a site many times throughout the year, but you do have to consider what to do with the dug up plant material, the rhizome fragments that resulted from digging, the dug up stalks, that kind of thing. In terms of that, the best way to kill off Japanese knotweed stalks is to put them on an impervious surface, like tarmac, driveway is fine, in like black plastic bags out in the sun, and let them bake for 2 weeks. Once the material gets like sludgy, it's dead and can be disposed of. But be very careful about how you deal with the rhizomes and dug up plant matter, and you will have to go back next year and the year after that probably to deal with just rhizome fragments that you missed while hand digging. I'd say really only consider hand digging on populations that are like less than 10 square meters in size. And now we get to grazing animals, which I guess could be considered a biocontrol, but I put it here. The premier grazing animal for Japanese knotweed is goats. They can be a very effective method for management of a lot of invasive species, and they can be an effective part of a toolkit for managing Japanese knotweed. More for suppressing a population than for really achieving eradication, but goats will eat pretty much anything. And Japanese knotweed fragments don't regrow after they pass through the gut of a goat and come out the other side. So it's why goats, I would say, are the premier grazing animal for this plant. You will need to fence them in or limit them to an area of interest, because like I said, they'll eat anything. If you have knotweed growing next to plants that you want to keep around, goats might not be the best option because they'll eat those plants too. I mentioned it before, but they're not likely to fully eradicate an infestation of Japanese knotweed because they're only affecting the above ground biomass. They can contribute to the stress and resource depletion for the infestation, but it would take a real constant herbivory effort by those goats to completely exhaust the infestation. Okay. Moving on to herbicides. Herbicides are generally much more effective in terms of reducing or eradicating a Japanese knotweed infestation. Sometimes they can be less labor intensive. but they're more expensive and they come with a whole host of other problems that, or I would say considerations, right? And the first is pollinators. The herbicides used for Japanese knotweed that are most effective for Japanese knotweed are toxic to bees and other pollinators. And that's not an insurmountable problem, but it is something to keep in mind because, like we talked about earlier, Japanese knotweed has prolific, abundant flowers, and bees really, really love them. You may have seen it in the stores. There's actually a different product, honey from bees that have visited Japanese knotweed. It tastes different. It's like a richer kind of, I guess I would say like a richer color, but it's a whole different product. So it's important to bees, it's important to beekeepers, and bees are important to us, and I would say beekeepers are important to us too. So if you're using an herbicide to deal with Japanese knotweed, you really want to think about the timing window for application. You want to wait pretty late in the year after Japanese knotweed is done flowering, after its flowers have senesced. That will pretty much guarantee that no pollinators visit the plants because there's no flowers on them to visit. It's also just, it's a good idea to contact any beekeepers in the area so that they're aware of the herbicide application. The next consideration when you're using herbicides is proximity to water. In New York, applying insecticides on or near water requires a very specific herbicide, pesticide license. They're restricted use pesticides, so legally only people with those licenses can apply them. Those people are also like well educated in the subject matter. They know how to responsibly use those herbicides to avoid harming the environment, or minimize harm to the environment, because the whole point is that you're harming the knotweed, right? It can also involve extra permitting for the project, depending on how close the Japanese knotweed is to the water. And just keep in mind, you'll need to hire an applicator to do that application if it's growing like in a stream. In terms of active ingredients for herbicides, I would say glyphosate or triclopyr are your two best bets, your most effective options for effectively treating Japanese knotweed. But there are studies that say even triclopyr is not very effective in the long term. You mostly just see short-term above ground biomass reduction. The two primary application methods for herbicides for Japanese knotweed are foliar sprays and stem injections. Foliar spray is what it sounds like. You're spraying the herbicide onto the leaves of the plant, and the plant absorbs the herbicide through its leaves and translocates it down through the stalk into the rhizomes. Stem injection is actually taking a specialized stem injection gun and sticking a needle into individual knotweed stalks and putting a tiny amount of herbicide into the plants. The stem injection gun used to be very expensive, but now they're only mildly expensive. For both of these application methods, the best application window is July through October, but again, with pollinators in mind, I'd say you'll probably want to trend later in the year for that application window. For foliar spray, you can get even more efficacy out of the spraying if you combine it with mechanical control. If you do an early season cut of your Japanese knotweed stalks and then spray the regrowth later in the year, that's even more effective than either cutting or herbicide on its own. In terms of stem injection, it is higher labor, but it's generally more effective, and it really, really reduces off-target impacts of the herbicide. An off-target impact is any time where an herbicide or an insecticide affects anything other than the specific species you want it to. And every part of herbicide or insecticide application is about minimizing those off-target risks. There will always be some risks when you deal with herbicides and insecticides and fungicides. They're poisons. There is no like guaranteed safe way to use them, but when you're dealing with invasive species, a lot of times it's like balancing the costs of, you know, different types of management or non-management. Oh, I think I've talked ahead of myself. I do this a lot. This is, I think, everything that I just said about foliar spray and stem injection. But I'll leave it on this window for a few seconds because I know we're recording and maybe people want to see the words instead of hearing my voice. Oh, there's some pictures of the stem injection gun there. It's a pretty specialized tool, but it is pretty cool. All right, getting into biocontrols. So actually, before I get into biocontrols, I want to talk a little, like very briefly, about something called integrated pest management, or IPM. And it is a sort of complex sounding term, but really all it means is combining different management methods together to achieve higher efficacy than any one of those management methods could achieve on its own. Like I mentioned, for the foliar spray, if you cut your stalks of knotweed earlier in the season and apply a foliar spray later in the season, you achieve even more population reduction and density reduction of the Japanese knotweed than if you had used either one of the options by themselves. So now I'll get into biocontrols, and before I talk specifically about the knotweed psyllid, I want to talk about biocontrols as a whole, because biocontrols really has a completely different timeline and a completely different scale of function and a different goal than a lot of the management methods that we've talked about earlier. I guess I'll start with the goal, because the end goal of any, like the end goal of a successful biocontrol campaign is not eradication of the target invasive species, but sort of very, very low level sustained population of the invasive species on the landscape to the point where it's not affecting the ecology, the economy, or human health negatively anymore. And that's because you need the invasive species to sustain populations of the biocontrol agents on the landscape. If we introduce a biocontrol that eradicates an invasive species, its food is gone now, or its host plant is gone, and it will die out too. And then if the invasive species ever comes back to the landscape, we have to bear additional costs to reintroduce the biocontrol agent. So the goal of biocontrol is not eradication, but just mitigating the impacts of the invasive species to the point where they're negligible. So that's a big difference in terms of the goals of biocontrol versus every other management option we've talked about. The scale of biocontrol is completely different. Most of what I'm talking about, I'm relating to like the private property level, or I'm talking about it in reference to how it would work at a regional scale. Biocontrol works across a landscape. One of the best things about biocontrols is, generally speaking, biocontrol agents like the psyllid here will seek out their own food sources. So they'll move with the plant. Biocontrol is something that you can introduce locally. You can, there are many cases of biocontrol agents that are commercially available that you can buy and introduce if you happen to have their host plant on on your property. And you can introduce them locally, just the they're insects or a fungus or a disease, it's gonna spread. So it's not just like hyper local control. And then the timeline for biocontrols is also much longer. Some of the management methods we've talked about, I mentioned like you could be dealing with 10 years of management, or if you're just doing cutting, you might be signing up to cut knotweed in perpetuity. It's very, very difficult to achieve eradication with just hand cutting Japanese knotweed stalks. You might just be doing that forever. The timeline for biocontrols it's not longer than forever. It is longer than 10 years. Biocontrol is a long, long process. There's unfortunately a history of biocontrols being released on the landscape without proper research first. And so it turns out a biocontrol agent is a generalist species, and it will target the target pest, but it will also eat other things, and that becomes a problem. These days, the research that goes into biocontrol agents before they can be released is really, really rigorous and intensive and takes a long time. There's climate matching. So the biocontrol agent has to have a reasonable chance of surviving the winters, reproducing the long term in whatever landscape you want to introduce it to. There's host specificity. So these days, there are no generalist biocontrols that are released in the US. It's all target-specific species. So the knotweed psyllid here, which was approved for release in the US and in New York, is specific to knotweed. It doesn't eat anything other than knotweed. There are many like starvation tests that have been done to see if it'll switch to anything related, and it doesn't. And that depth of research is done for every biocontrol, but that takes a long time. There's also the scale of like actual establishment of the biocontrols. It's frequently very difficult to like artificially reproduce these biocontrol agents in laboratory settings. Oftentimes they're pretty hard to collect in the wild, which means we're releasing quite small numbers of biocontrol agents, and it just takes them a long, long time to build up numbers to the point where their populations are high enough to affect the invasive species that they're targeting. There's an example is Laricobius nigrinus is a biocontrol agent for hemlock woolly adelgid, which is an invasive insect that attacks hemlock trees. There have been cases where the biocontrol agent, Laricobius, was introduced and wasn't even recollected at the site successfully until 8 years later. Biocontrol is a long-term project, but it's self-sustaining, and it hopefully is in perpetuity on the landscape to deal with the invasive species wherever it occurs. So there's a lot of benefits to biocontrols as well. Unfortunately, I have some bad news about the knotweed psyllid, which was released in 2 locations in New York in 2020, and along with several other locations on the US East Coast. It has not yet been recollected at its release sites, and it's in doubt if it's successfully reproducing. But 2020 to now is pretty short term. We're always on the lookout for multiple biocontrols for an invasive species, because frequently it takes a complex or a cocktail of invasive species to achieve good control for a invasive species. Oh, okay. That's all I've got for us tonight on Japanese knotweed besides the Q&A portion. So I'll leave this last slide up.
Thank you so much, Dan. So we do have a few questions in the Q&A and in the chat. I'll go in the order that they were received. So the first one here is, if Japanese knotweed grows through brick walls, concrete, and asphalt, why should mere tarp stop it?
So if you're going to use tarp, it's not going to completely stop it. Japanese knotweed will grow through tarp. It'll poke right through it. Not every stalk will do that, though. Some stalks will be smothered, they'll be bent. They might get too hot, and the above ground stalk will just wilt. But some stalks will be robust enough to poke through, and that's why you need that follow-up survey work to patch up your tarp, or in some cases replace it. And you also want to spend that time to look for those runners where you have the rhizomes that are sprouting stalks, or you've got the horizontally growing stalks that are poking up at the edge of your tarp. So that's, I guess, that's what you would spend your follow-up monitoring on if you're going the tarp approach. And you also, again, you want to make sure the tarp extends well past like 10, 12, 15 feet past the visible above ground knotweed stalks.
Okay, and then a question came through right after that. When we are using tarps, what kind of tarp? What thickness? How thick is it?
Okay, so
I guess thickness of the tarps. What kind?
yeah, the thicker the tarp, the better. The thicker it is, the less likely you are to have to come back and repair or replace the tarp. I would say go for full-on hardware cloth if you have it available to you in large amounts.
Okay, so they would just be looking for a thick hardware cloth. Is there any, do you know any measurements on those, or?
Not off the
Exactly.
top of my head, no, but if you email me, I will get you specifics on that.
Great. Then I think the next question was, what about hack and squirt?
So hack and squirt is a term. I think what they're in for knotweed, I think a more specific term would probably be cut stump, which is when you cut the stalk and you apply pesticide directly to the stalk. It can be effective for similar reasons as the injection gun, but I don't know if I've seen it, at least not on the pesticides we use. I haven't seen it labeled for that use. And I should have mentioned this when I was talking about the pesticide section. Every pesticide is insecticides, herbicides, fungicides. They're all very, very specific in how they can be used, what they can be used on, where they can be used in terms of habitat types, and how you can apply them. That's all in the label of the pesticide. And it's very, very important that you read the label of whatever pesticide you're considering using on knotweed to make sure that that application, that formulation of pesticide is actually labeled for however you want to treat your knotweed. If you want to use foliar spray, you need a formulation of herbicide that's labeled for that use. If you want to use it by water, you have to use a formulation that's labeled for that use. If you go outside of the bounds of a pesticide's label, there are really, really heavy fines that can go along with that if there's like extraneous damages from misuse. And it's just illegal to use any pesticide in an off-label manner.
This next question, where and how do I obtain the knotweed psyllid? What time of the year is best to introduce them in Greene County? Where do I find reliable research on them? And I think I'll add a follow-up. Are biocontrols something that anyone can release and have access to, or is there any kind of certification or
It
training
it
for that?
depends on the state of the biocontrol agent. So it's a case-by-case basis. I guess I would zoom out from these specific questions really quickly because I wanted to reiterate that despite it being a pretty short term since the original introduction of the knotweed psyllids in New York, it seems like people are thinking that they are not being successful on the landscape. So I don't know that I would recommend that you do obtain them. I'm not sure the knotweed psyllids even got out of research permit phase. So there's several phases of releases. There's controlled release experiments. There's wild research releases. Eventually it gets to a point where you can buy stuff commercially. I have not participated in the knotweed psyllid releases, and I unfortunately don't know the time of year that you could introduce them. But if you email me directly, I will send you a report on them.
Great, thank you. We'll follow up with that. Next question. What if you planted another competitive plant like sumac?
So the thing about knotweed is it is a pretty tall plant, but it can be overtopped by trees. It does do pretty well in partial shade situations, so you would need to plant pretty densely and achieve pretty dark shade to really push it out. But in general, invasive species management almost always results in disturbance to whatever area you're managing, which is a really great opportunity for other invasives to move in or for that invasive to reintroduce and grow vigorously. So planting native species is a really, really great way to sort of head off that invasive species rush to that disturbed area. So yeah, I would say after you've done management of knotweed and achieved some pretty reasonable population reduction, or if you're planning to remove the above ground biomass each year through whatever mechanical method you're dealing with, I would really encourage you to plant native species, dogwoods, willows. Yeah, they're anything that grows, well, anything you want anything that can grow tall quite quickly, or can grow very, very dense if you're looking at shrubs, because that knotweed got to your location somehow. So even if you get eradication on your property, there's still always the chance that it could come back if it like washed down from upstream. So you want a really robust ecosystem that will be able to compete against new Japanese knotweed introductions.
This next one, how do you determine the tier of infestation in your own yard?
It's a relative thing. So tier 1 is not present. That one's easy. If you don't have an invasive on your property, it's tier 1. Also the easiest to manage because you can just go talk to your neighbors if they have it and ask them to take it out and replace it with something else, or ask them to manage it. Tier 2 is relatively low population count. Tier 3 is more than that, and tier 4 is ubiquitous. On the region level, we have them scaled at like tiers 2, 3, and 4 are relative to each other. So the actual count of populations across the crisp landscape for what counts as a tier 2 can vary based on how many populations are present for other species. But it's a relative assessment. So if it's a new infestation of something that's only 1 or 2 years since it was introduced, I would say that's a tier 2. Tier 3 is just a few years more than that. And if it's something that has just gone unmanaged for like 8 or more years, that's a tier 4. But it's a loose assessment.
This next question is a little bit more someone's experience here. When I found Japanese knotweed on my property last year, I did all the wrong things. I found a group that said the only way to control is glyphosate after flowering, but before the freeze, as that will bring the glyphosate into the rhizomes and stop them. After doing that last fall, I have a handful of tiny plants this year.
That well, we're still pretty early in the year. The stalks I've seen, the ones that have gone unmanaged are about 3 or 4 feet tall now, around us in Mount Trumper at least. But like I said at the start, there is no single swipe management option for Japanese knotweed. Even herbicides, while they're among the most effective tools that you can use for Japanese knotweed, you're going to be looking at multiple years of management. You don't have to follow up herbicide with more herbicide, though. If the population has reduced to a point where it's a small enough patch that you want to tarp it, or you might consider hand digging it, that is a potential option. So just because you used herbicide the first year doesn't mean you have to always use herbicide going forward.
Okay, so the next question, it says, thanks, Dan. My experience talking with local town highway and parks department is that mowing is almost universally practiced among these land managers. Do you or CRISP interact with these departments or have any thoughts?
So this is a big thing that gets talked about at like invasive species conferences and stuff. It's an unfortunate reality. A lot of time, like parks departments and highway departments are budget limited, labor limited, and there's very real realities about reducing risks of deer, increasing line of sight for roads, that kind of thing. That they, like, for just liability's sake, they have to consider. That being said, as hard against mowing as I am, like, I'm never gonna recommend mowing. It is possible to do it responsibly if you're like collecting all the material. Well, actually, I'll take that back. You can clean your equipment between sites, and so you can mow and like spread the fragments on the site, but not move it off site if you clean your equipment before you move it off site. So if you clean your mower before you move it from wherever you're mowing, that's like as responsible as it gets. You're still risking those fragments reestablishing locally, but there are like more responsible ways to do mowing of Japanese knotweed. We have done some trainings with highway departments in the past for identifying invasive species. We've tended to highlight things that are like health risks, like wild parsnip, giant hogweed, that kind of thing, where they really risk being hurt and just interacting with the plant. But we have done trainings that included Japanese knotweed in the past.
The next question, what does by water mean? I live across the street from the East Branch of the Delaware River. I guess maybe how close.
So the idea is there are herbicides that are very, very toxic to fish, amphibians, aquatic invertebrates, and they don't want any chance of that herbicide reaching surface water, groundwater, wells, that kind of thing. So it's just I would say the applicator that you would need to hire to apply near water will know the correct buffer for whatever formulation of pesticide they're using. Yeah.
Next question, what can you tell us about Japanese knotweed's native habitat and natural enemies?
I am not super familiar with the details of the Japanese ecosystems where it comes from. I think this question is probably coming at us from the biocontrol perspective, and oftentimes for biocontrols, there are research trips and lots of back and forth between researchers from a species' native environment and those of the affected environment where it's invasive to establish which natural predators or herbivores or parasites are most likely to succeed in the area where it's invasive, are the easiest to potentially reproduce in a lab setting in large numbers. But I will say one of the reasons that Japanese knotweed is successful here is because on a climate level, Japan is very, very similar to where we are here. But I don't know many specifics about Japan's ecology.
This next question was asking if I could reread what the viewer wrote about their control methods. So I'll just jump over there.
Yeah. I think I know what this was about. After I answered, I reread it really quickly, and I think I missed a part of it.
Sure. So that was just they did all the wrong things and found a group that said the only way to control it is glyphosate after flowering, but before the freeze, as that will bring the glyphosate into the rhizomes and stop them. After doing that last fall, there are now tiny plants.
I think the part they wanted me to refocus on is glyphosate after flowering. And so while when I originally read this question, I thought it meant after the flowers senesce, but it's possible that this meant just after the flowers emerge. Yeah, you definitely do want to wait until after flowering is finished. You don't want to see any flowers on the knotweed when you apply your herbicides. I hope that clarified it.
Yeah, thank you for rereading that. So I'm assuming we're on the right track there. And the last question, we have another thank you. This is a great update. And one more question here. How many years would goats have to be brought in?
Many years. It's similar in effect to cutting the knotweed. It's just stressing the plant out by removing its above ground biomass, which can be effective over a very long time period. I would say goats, like cutting, are part of a toolkit. They're not the only management option. So you might do goats for a couple of years and then move on to tarping or mesh or something like that. Or you might just keep goats around and do it for a long time because goats are pretty cool. But if you're just doing goats, and your target species is Japanese knotweed, expect to have them around for a long time.
Thank you. It looks like we have made it through all of our questions. I haven't seen any others come through. So I think we can go ahead and wrap up. Thank you so much, Dan. This was really informative, and we really appreciate you taking the time to be here.
I'm
Thank you, everyone.
happy to talk. Have a good night, guys.
Take care. Night.